Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Martin Dobeš. I am a member of EPALE team. I will say a few words about EPALE in a moment. And I would like to welcome everybody to our today's discussion, which is a part of EPALE Online Academy, long-term project that we have. And actually today it is the first occasion that I have the privilege to welcome our guest who is from abroad. This is actually first foreign guest from the United Kingdom. And we will talk about quite interesting topic about what we should expect in the area of learning and development in company training and so on in the future, what we are actually experiencing now and what kind of changes we can anticipate in the future. So it's a very interesting topic. But before I introduce my today's guest, I will say a few technical words, some technicalities are necessary. So I would like to ask everybody to kindly keep your microphones switched off or unmute, unless of course you intend to speak, because at the beginning I will ask some questions. I will ask my guest some questions, and then later on you can join our discussion. I will gladly give you the word and space. So it's going to last about 1 hour. Our whole session will last about 1 hour, and after like 30 or 40 minutes, I will give you some space to join. So now I think I'm going to introduce my today's guest. His name is Paul Matthewse. He is from United Kingdom, but I think originally from New Zealand, if I'm not mistaken. Hi, Paul. Good afternoon to you.
Hiya. Great to be here.
Paul is actually quite internationally recognized speaker in the area of learning and development. As I read in his website, and I will quote it, he is a speaker who loves to challenge the status quo. He can later on say what exactly it means. He has had a really diverse career. He started as an engineer in engineering, and also he has been traveling around a lot. We will say a few words about it. And also he has been engaged in information technology, but for the past years, he's been trying to improve the performance of people. So I would say this is something like learning and development. So like in training area and company training and so on. I should also say that he's a writer too. He's an author of several books or booklets, which became an instant bestseller, if I'm not mistaken. And actually, we have translated one booklet into Czech language, and actually there is another one which we have also translated, and you can find, there is one which is named 17 Essential Learning and Development Tips, and you can find, if you are interested, you can find it on our website. This discussion is actually a part of a EPALE project, which EPALE stands for Electronic Platform for Adult Learning, and it's a project run by European Commission. And it's actually a huge hub. All the European Union countries participate on it, including United Kingdom still. And you can find a lot of articles, analysis, data, and even opportunities to meet other partners within the European Union and outside. So if you are interested, you can go to www.epale.cz. This discussion will be later on translated to Czech language, and you can find it on YouTube. So I just want to notify you that it's being recorded. Okay. So now let's start with the first question. I thought maybe this could be a little bit personal, Paul. I know about you that you have been traveling a lot, and I know that you've been to Sahara, and I know that you climbed Kilimanjaro mountain. Can you say what actually you have learned from these travels, and what is actually important, and you can use it in your professional career or life?
Oh, yeah. Well, the travels were interesting. I mean, I grew up and I learned a lot while I was doing it. But I think one thing that became very apparent all those years ago when I was doing that is I was working for a travel expedition company. So I wasn't just on my own. I was actually leading groups of people into some quite remote corners of the world. And as I said, up Kilimanjaro and across the Sahara and across the Himalayas and other places. And what became very apparent was that people change when confronted with new experiences. So if they go through on those trips, there was always something new almost every day they'd never encountered before. And they had to stop and think and decide, how do I deal with this new experience, with this new situation? And in doing so, they had to lean on what they learned before. They had to potentially learn something new by asking me or asking a colleague or just figuring it out. And that changed them. Those new decisions they made changed them. So those changes then often rippled through to other parts of their lives. And, you know, they say that travel broadens the mind. And that's one of the sort of reasons for it, is all the new experiences that people have. Probably if I had described to them, this is what will occur when you enter that marketplace in the middle of the African jungle, or this is what will occur when you get to 5,000 meters on Mount Kilimanjaro because the oxygen's running a bit low, they're not really going to understand what that's like until they go there and do it. And that, I think, is one of the critical things, that until people get into that situation, they just, no matter how much you might teach them things or facts or information, they're not really going to know how they themselves personally are going to respond in that situation. And people will respond differently. So I think that's something that's important about learning and development is, yes, we can give people facts, we can give them content, but they need to go and experience it. They need to go and use it in order to understand how it will work for them or how it won't work for them. So there's that kind of contextual experiential aspect that really has to be taken into account. And this is why I'm so keen on people experimenting and practicing with something they have learned. And that's how it becomes embedded in who they are and what they do. Just teaching someone something's not enough. There's a lot more to do before you're going to get any benefits out of that initial teaching. And that was something that certainly came through on those trips. I mean, I changed and grew up a lot when I started doing it. And then as I became used to those experiences, my rate of growth slowed down. And at that point, I was able, in a sense, to observe others going through new experiences and seeing how they were changing incredibly rapidly, sometimes over short periods of time as they encountered a lot of new stuff. So yeah, I think that was something that's informed the way I think about L&D for sure.
I actually, one of the things that we are going to mention and we are going to talk about is behavior. And I think what you just said, you know, personal experience, how important it is, not only while on travel, but also in companies, in organizations. That's actually makes the bridge. You know, I will talk about you know, behavior and behavior change later on. Okay, so now actually the name of our today's discussion is a little bit provocative, and you already mentioned it, is to how to restart training or learning and development in this year and later in the future. And we all know what's happening now in the world. You know, we know that we are actually now approaching what might be an end of this pandemic crisis, whatever you call it. And of course, every crisis has a seed of challenge. It's a space for changing something. So we actually need, as a society, we need crisis, because crises are good for us. It's an opportunity to change something. And we have already seen also in the area of learning and development some significant changes, like shifting to online, which is one of the things, you know, and so on. So what to expect now from the short-term future? What do you think we can expect now? Let's say, you know, by the end of the year, as for learning and development. For example, do you think that we will go back to workplace learning, or we will just completely stay in the online environment, or will there be some other trends?
I think it's going to depend on the company and the culture of the company. Some companies have discovered they can do a lot virtually and remotely and will continue to use that because it's working for them. Others have a more traditional mindset and will try and go back to what they were because that's where their comfort lies. I don't think they ever will. I think too much has changed. They won't ever get back to what they were, and certainly not in the new world, but they will try. I think what concerns me the most about L&D is it's done some amazing things, some absolutely incredible things I've seen that people did very quickly, and I'm sure you guys have got experience of it as well. When the pandemic first started, there was incredible stuff done fast, and the response from L&D to create new courses, for new learning that was required was amazing. I think my concern is that most of that was done very quickly, and effectively those are prototypes. And they're still, in many cases, being run right now as prototypes that are effectively kind of put into production. And that's not right. You need to go back to a prototype and say, now that we know it works, how do we refine it so that we can put it into production effectively? And so I think there's a real fear I have of the knee-jerk response, the fast response that we did is going to become frozen somehow, and that'll just keep running forward. So we've got to keep going a little bit and look at what we did and saying, how can we refine that and take advantage of what we've learned? And also, how can we embed it into the business in a way that it won't get thrown out again by managers who don't fully understand that it is possible to do it that way? Because there's certainly programs, and maybe we'll talk about one of them later in one of your other questions about, you know, that are doing better remotely and online than they ever did in the classroom. And so why would you want to throw that away if it's there? The other interesting thing that I've come across is, I'm from New Zealand originally, I think you mentioned that, and I still keep in touch, obviously, with people over there in learning and development. And of course, they have had very little lockdown at all. So over the entire pandemic, they've more or less been running as normal with full training rooms, classrooms, everything. So no change other than no tourists. But otherwise, the country's more or less operating just as it always did. So very interesting comment made by someone I spoke to over there is they said, we are worried that we are getting behind because the rest of the world has had the crisis, as you pointed out, that has enforced a level of inventivity, innovation and creativity and change. And we haven't had that. So we've not been pushed to the edge and had to do new things. So we're still operating the way we used to. And that actually puts us behind the curve. And that was quite an interesting comment that I think we've learned a lot during the pandemic, a lot more than what we think we have as well. And also we've learned that things can happen far faster than what we ever thought they could. So yes, there's a lot of change coming, but I think it's important that we go back to basic principles and, you know, what do we do next? But I remember a story. I grew up on a farm in New Zealand, and I remember as a boy watching my father replace a rotting old bit of twine or rope that was holding together a gate that was broken. And he was putting a new piece of twine on that gate to hold it together because the old one was rotting. And he turned and looked at me and said, there's nothing so permanent as the temporary. In other words, that he was replacing that twine every couple of years without fixing the gate. So the temporary solution just stayed there year after year after year. And that's kind of one of my concerns about what's going on in some companies, not all, but some in learning and development right now.
That's a very good example. And I would think that this example would fit to many of the training companies here in the Czech Republic, you know, because what we have seen, actually, we can have a look at what we have seen from the start of this crisis. There were many companies who became basically paralyzed. What shall we do now? All our clients are used to some way of working, and somehow we don't have any tools to adapt. There were some companies that said to ourselves, okay, there is no other option than to transfer what we have to online. So they basically took what they had, and they just made it into online, which was not a good solution, because it's not about that you can take something and you can just transfer it like to online environment. Only some companies, the smart ones, they understood that it's a different mentality, it's a different concept, that you have to adapt it, all the way around. So the question is, what can we do now as a company, as a training company? What shall we change? What experience shall we use? And what can we do as a client, as a company that actually needs to, because, I don't know about the UK, but here in the Czech Republic, as for investments into training, this is one of the first, if you have limited budget, if you have a crisis, one of the first thing that it's cut off. The manager will say, okay, we are having, our budgets are low, so we are going without training, and because we can postpone it, obviously. So it was one of the first thing in each crisis, that. So now many companies are, in front of a big task. How can we continue as a company, and what kind of training we should, develop and propose for the company. And another question is actually the government. What can a central government do in order to contribute to to improve the conditions? What do you think?
I think you say, what sort of training should we develop? I would suggest one that works, which
okay.
is, and what I mean by that is going back to basics and say, why are we doing this training in the first place? And that question hasn't really changed just because of the pandemic. How we deliver stuff might have changed. The channel that we deliver through, we've had that change enforced on us. But the basic questions that were often not answered were, why are we doing it in the first place? And the answer often given, well, some manager somewhere said they wanted it. Well, that's not a good enough answer, in my opinion. So I always go back to saying, well, what are we trying to achieve with training? So when you're talking about how to restart training, or how to get past that paralysis, or what to do next, you've got to go back to basics and saying, so then the question is, well, why are we doing the training? And the answer to that is because we want people to do things differently to the way they're doing them right now. Duh, pretty obvious. Unless, of course, you've got compliance or regulatory reasons, in which case you might need to be training in order to get people through some compliance or qualifications. But having said that, even if you're doing that, you still need them behaving the right way. You don't just want them ticking a box and saying, yes, I understand this compliance stuff on health and safety, but I'm still going to do it the old way. So you're still talking about behavior change. And so there's the question is, rather than say, how do I deliver this training? We need to be asking the question, how do I deliver this behavior change? So start with the end in mind, which is the behavior change. And so any manager that's going to ask for training, the first question is going to be, well, what are they doing now? And what do you want them to do instead? And you've got to ask, how do we bridge the gap between what they're doing now and what we want them to do instead? In other words, you've got a present state, you have a desired output, which are these output behaviors. So you can make a list of the things, these new behaviors that you want to achieve. And of course, you need to define those behaviors in a way that means you can recognize them when you see them. In other words, when you see something or hear something, then I know that particular behavior is taking place. So in other words, you're talking about observable behaviors. And as soon as you have that list of output behaviors you want, and some criteria you can use to measure whether you're seeing those behaviors or not, then you've got a way of measuring your progress from where you are now to where you want to be. And then your question again comes back, how do we deliver those behaviors to those people? In other words, given this particular shift in behavior, what are the ways that people Or what are the things that people need to do in order to bridge that gap? Do they need to learn something? Maybe yes, maybe no. Do they need to practice something? Probably. Do they need to sit in a corner and reflect on things? Probably. Do they need to discuss it with colleagues? Probably. So there's all these different things that you need to put in place over a period of time, because behavior change doesn't happen overnight. It's certainly not at a training event, typically. It's very rare. And that's why most training events don't have that much impact when people go back to the workplace. So what you've got to do is start, and that's why I say design training that works, which means extending it into a program spread over time, rather than just an event-based thing where you put someone in a classroom and fill their head with a bunch of information. There's more to do. And then there's a whole lot of different levers you can pull to make sure that you design that sequence, that workflow of tasks, if you like, that they need to undertake to get from where they are to where you want them to be, which is behaving differently in a specific way that will help execute the organizational strategy. So that's when I talk about going back to basics, is think, what do we want? What behaviors do we want? And in order to get those behaviors, and we've got a defined set of measures so we know how to measure them. And by the way, measuring them, you can ask people to self-report on their behavior, but a much better way is usually a multi-rater tool of some sort, a very simplistic 360 type of thing. And that will give you the information you want. If you run that at the beginning, at the end of a program, then you can look at the difference in observable behavior against the behaviors you've listed and the criteria you've got. And that will give you, in effect, a Kirkpatrick level 3 evaluation across your program. But that all needs to be set up at the beginning. It's too late if you've already started running the program, because you need those behaviors and that list of them in order to design the program. And then you design the steps they need to take to get from where they are. So it's a bit like a sat-nav system, for example. If you if you put Berlin into your sat-nav and you follow the instructions, you'll eventually get there, provided you follow the instructions, and the instructions are good. So what we're doing is that list of behaviors is like our destination. The activities that we want people to do over a period of time are these turn-by-turn instructions like the sat-nav gives you. And provided people follow those instructions and they're well designed, they will get to that end behavior that you want. So it's kind of like it is possible to guarantee that output. But you need to start with that end in mind. What behaviors do we want? And then what skills do they need to practice? And perhaps what knowledge do they want in order to practice the skills? And then, by the way, if you find yourself wanting to give them some knowledge, they don't need to practice the skills. You should, smack yourself on the hand and say, don't do that, because they don't need that knowledge to practice the skills to get the behaviors we want. Whereas too often we overtrain with too much information that they don't need. So there's just a very high level view of where I think people should be thinking about training, is starting with the end in mind, which is the behaviors. And that you need to do that by obviously having that discussion with the manager who's asking for the training and saying, well, why do you think they need a training in the first place? What do you want them to do instead of what they're doing now? Very simple question to ask a manager. What do you want them to do instead of what they're doing now? And that brings the conversation around to a behavioral based output. Even if he's busy asking for a feedback skills course, say, well, actually, I don't care about that. Maybe that's the answer, maybe not. But what do you want them to be doing, and how will you know they're doing it?
You have actually already answered my another question, which was actually about the behavior change, because in the old world, it's actually quite a fresh and new concept. Talking about behavior and how to change it. In the old world, we got used to hear about 3 basic concepts, and it's skills, competencies, and knowledge, right? How does it compare? What's actually the difference between this, concept like skills, competencies, and knowledge, and behavior change? How does it come together?
Okay. If you want people performing adequately to execute an organizational strategy and get the results that are required for the organization, then they need to be capable at the point of work of doing whatever task you give them at the time you give it to them. So at that point of work, at their desk, at their tool station, wherever that is, when you give them a task, they should be able to do it. Now, they can do it if there are two things in place. They can do it if A, they are individually competent. In other words, they've got the knowledge, skills, the attitude, the understanding and behaviors in order to bring to that workstation and say, yeah. But also the environment that surrounds them is the second piece of the puzzle, and that too has to be competent. In other words, the environment must have the right tools, the right spare parts, the right management structure, the right culture, the right information readily available, and all of those other bits and pieces that make up the environment that surrounds someone while they're working. And then when the environment's competent and the individual's competent, they will come together. And when those two things are at over threshold competence, then you will get that person capable at the point of work. But if you take any of those things away, then they're not capable at that point of work. So for example, if I put a wonderful actor on the stage in a theater, but I turn the electricity off, their environment's missing something important. There's no sound, there's no lights. So no matter how competent the actor is, they cannot perform. They are incapable of performing at that point in time because there's something missing in the environment. If a mechanic needs to fix a car but doesn't have the spare part, they're incapable of fixing the car at that point in time, even though they're a very competent mechanic.
That's a good point.
So we have to look at the whole environment that surrounds someone while they're doing their job in order to understand. So this is the whole performance diagnostics process. And so we've got to be looking, A, at the behaviors we want for that person, but also we have to be looking at, quote unquote, the behaviors of the organization that surrounds them as they're doing that work. And very often you'll find, and in the research I've done, 70 to 80% of the time when someone cannot do a job that's in front of them, it's not them, it's their environment that's inhibiting them from doing the job. Just think over the last month that you've been doing things. There were a number of times you failed to do what you wanted to do. Chances are you knew what to do. It's just that you couldn't do it because there was something else outside of you that, you know, the computer broke down, you didn't have the right information, somebody didn't deliver something on time, whatever it was, whether it was in your control or not, something happened that meant you couldn't do the task and perform at the required level. It wasn't necessarily lack of knowledge or skills. And yet so often when people are not performing in an organization, they get sent to training, which is about knowledge and skills. And 80% of the time when they're not performing, it's nothing to do with lack of knowledge or skills. It's the environment that's getting in the way. Even if that's just a manager. There's a lovely photograph kicking around the web with a donkey on a cart in an eastern country. And the donkey is lifted up on the cart traces. So his feet are off the ground because the cart has been overloaded at the back, so it's unbalanced. So the donkey is perfectly competent of pulling the cart. But if we sent the donkey to donkey school to do more cart training, it's not going to help because the poor donkey has a bad manager and can't perform because the manager has overloaded the cart wrong. So that's about the environment has defeated the competence of the individual. So you've got to do that whole diagnostics process. So if you're not getting the behaviors that you want, where are we now? What behaviors do you want instead? One of the questions you've got to ask during that diagnostics is what are the barriers to those new behaviors that we want? In other words, if we remove those barriers, would those behaviors automatically occur because it's possible for them to occur, but they're not occurring right now because of the barriers? That's the first place to look. And often that'll be where you go. And that means you won't need the training. So it's not about delivering new behaviors, it's just getting rid of the inhibitors that will stop the behaviors that could already happen because people already know what to do. So that whole diagnostics process is also really important before you decide to do any training.
That's a smart concept. I really like it. The question that I already had and connected to it is, I understand you need to measure, you need to do diagnosis for different processes. Some of them are, regard the whole environment, as you say. I understand that. some of the things go after the people, the human resources, and you need to analyze what skills they need and so on. But the question is, we are talking about human beings. We are not just you can't measure everything, can you? Is it really like you can go with the diagnosis, you can go so deep on all the sides that you just mentioned, on the environment side, on the side of the people, management, leadership, and so on? Can you really measure it so well that you can set up the objectives and you can set up all the goals?
I think so. I mean, and it's not about going deep, and it's actually not that difficult. I think a lot of people make it more difficult than it is. If somebody's not, if you have a team of people who are not doing things the way you want them to do, you just go and ask them, well, what's stopping you doing it this way? And they'll tell you. And they might say, well, I don't know how to do it the new way. Okay, well, we better train you. Or they might say, well, I can't do it that new way because that department over there never sends us the parts in time. Okay, so there's a process problem that has to be dealt with. Now, those are very simplistic. Or the mechanic says, I can't fix the car because so often there's a part missing. Okay, there's a problem in the parts reordering process in the garage for the mechanic. So really it's about some very simple diagnosis and saying, well, where does the problem lie? So this is a simple performance consultancy conversation, and that's pretty simple. Now, part of what you will do when you're doing that is saying, what does good look like? When we go from the way things are now to the way things are in the future, what does good look like in terms of how we see people behaving? In other words, if I was a fly on the wall, if I stood in the balcony or the mezzanine floor and looked out over the workshop, what would I see? And how would I know those new behaviors are occurring? So there's your measure, is you've got to couch your outputs in terms of observable behaviors. And usually that's something you can see or sometimes something you can hear. Usually. And then you can measure. And of course, as soon as you have those measurable outputs, then you've got a way of figuring out, what's our progress towards what we want. And if you're not making progress, you've got to say, well, there's got to be another barrier in place somewhere that we didn't manage to find. So let's go find it. And by the way, very often, one of those biggest barriers will be the organization culture. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily easy to fix all of these things, but it's relatively easy to find them. And then you know what you're targeting or what you're aiming at, and what you're trying to change. But normally what happens is nobody even knows that. So the training is pushed out there without any real idea of what it's designed to achieve. It's just, oh, it'd be a good idea to do some management training. Yeah, okay, but why? What's triggered that whole concept that we might even need it?
Training for training.
You've got to start with the end in mind. It's a real simple concept. And most people don't with the learning and development. Or when they start, the end in mind is putting 20 people through a management course. That's their end. And that's just not good enough because that has no business impact or no business alignment.
It actually implies sometimes you have to say unpleasant words or words which are not expected to a manager of a company. In our case, in the case of Czech Republic, there are lots of companies where the person responsible for training and for the whole issue is an HR department, human resources department. Usually the manager of this department makes certain decisions as for training and so on. And obviously we need involvement of the whole company, not only on this level, but also line production managers and so on. And this might be a problem, resistance. You need to convince a certain manager or a group of managers that a change is needed. And also the other thing is the mentality. The Czechs are maybe a little bit similar to English, quite conservative. There are many people who don't like fast changes. I actually dislike it very much. We like to be in a stable environment. We like our certainties. And if you know if you deal with a person and you know you need to convince this person that a change is needed, and you know that this person doesn't want any change in his spirit, you can feel it, that you will give him facts, but you will feel that this person will put a strong resistance.
Actually, I'll challenge you a little bit on that, Martin, because people do like change. They get married, they change partners, they buy a house, they buy a new car, they change all the time. But that's at their request, at their desire. Where they react or abreact to change is where it's forced upon them. So it is about getting buy-in from people. So I never like the idea that people avoid change. We change our lives all the time, most of us. But it seems under our control, and we're doing it for reasons that matter to us. So that's what it's about. So it's about how you have the conversation with the manager who's asking for training. So that HR person, that L&D person is need to go back to the question I said before. What are they doing now and what do you want them to do instead? Okay, let's focus our conversation on the way they do their job, not about what they know or what they can learn or what you might want to teach them. Let's put that to one side. Let's focus on what do you want them to do? And then you can have a conversation with the manager about how did you learn to do something differently? What's something you're doing differently now to what you did it last month or 2 months ago? And then how did you make that change in the way you're doing that particular job? And chances are, it'll be something they learned over time through practicing a little bit, experimenting, reflecting on it. And then you can start to relate that change in behavior to their own personal circumstances. And then they'll start to get it that actually, if I want my team to change the way they're doing things, I'm going to have to take them through a process in order to help them make those changes. And yes, it's new thinking. And that might not be an easy or simple conversation, but you've just got to keep having it over and over and over again. And if you do that together with then focusing on that performance diagnostics, take them through a performance diagnostics process. That, by the way, is sort of the subject of my second book on capability at work. So, and the third one was on learning transfer. So if you do end up within the classroom, then learning transfer is what you need to focus on. But the second book on capability will actually help the L&D people go through a process with the manager to say, well, what is it that you want out of this? And you can also ask questions like, if we don't make this change in behavior in the next 6 months, what's it going to cost the organization? Because then you can start to say, well, actually, this is a fairly important problem. It's either a €1,000 problem or a 10,000 or a €1 million problem. How big is this problem? And that also means, by the way, as an HR person, you can prioritize the way that you work with different parts of the organization. Because if someone comes to you with a €10,000 problem and someone else over the different departments got a €10 million problem, guess who you're going to have to work with first?
Sure.
so you need to have that whole diagnostics process. And as you take managers through that, what will tend to change, and I've seen this time and time again, is a manager will typically come to HR or L&D and say, I want this training. I want 2-day feedback skills training for my team or something like that. And then you can say, right, let's sit down and go through a diagnostics process to figure out what's getting in the way of that, to figure out what we need to do, how we need to help them change their behavior to what's going to work. How do we do that? Let's figure out, go through the diagnostics process. And typically what will happen is a number of things will surface because you're taking that manager through a thinking process they've not done. And they will start to understand at a deeper level what's going on. And then they'll start to say, oh, hang on, I now see what's happening. As they start to realize there are barriers to what they're seeking in terms of that new behavior. And some of those barriers they can fix today for nothing, no cost. And some of them might need some training, some of them might need some process changes and so on. So that'll start giving them lots of different things they can go and try and do. And what they'll start thinking is, now I know what I need. That thing I used to want, that training, is now not probably the best thing to do. I get that. Let's focus on what's needed here rather than what I used to want. So there's about helping differentiate what they want from what they really need and making that visible to them. If you just tell them this is what you need, that's not good enough because they won't go with you. It's what you were saying before. They won't. You've got to take them through the process to help them get visibility of what they need and almost for them to see it for themselves. And then they're going to say, that's what I want. Now I know that. Now I want it. And then when you deliver it, you'll have a much better chance of getting some good results because pretty obviously you're now focusing on the real problem, not the one the manager thought was there, but probably wasn't.
These are very good points. Thanks. That's really interesting. Okay, they say learn from examples. So the things that you've just said, can you, do you know a company, it could be from United Kingdom or elsewhere, that actually use this concept with a success, or they have some innovative approach that you just described?
Well,
don't give us any names, just what they did. We've,
alongside all the work I do and the writing and the consultancy, we've also got a software platform, and one of our clients that's using that has been doing mid to senior level leadership training in one of the big government departments here in the UK for many years. They're the supplier. Every year they put between 100 and 200 people through this leadership program, have been for a number of years. And of course, it was always traditional classroom based. What happened last year is they couldn't do that. So they used our platform to build that out into a program that ran over 6 months with lots of little events and a collaborative approach and a number of things. And a lot of that, by the way, was the same as what I described in the ebook that got translated for your yearbook thing. I think you can mention to people where that is. They can get that ebook off my own site in English, obviously, but it has been translated and that may be available to them. I don't know. But what they discovered was that when they spread the program out, so it wasn't just a classroom event, it was now spread out over time with lots of little things, that the behavior change was much more evident and much more visible and much more sustainable over time. So it really became embedded. And the client, the government department has come back and said, we don't want to go back to the classroom again. This is working so much better than it used to because of the new design. It's the same basic content and material. It's just been completely redesigned to work differently and running on a software platform so it can all be managed remotely. And actually they're putting another couple of hundred people through it this year saying, we want to do the same thing again, and we're even going to put more managers on it because it's working so well. So there's an example where they took an existing program, changed it, modified it, brought it online, and then took into account this idea of spreading it out of a program over time and doing things in a different way. And it's working way better to the extent that the client doesn't want to go back to what they had.
I have a lot of other questions, but now I feel actually it's time to give space to also the other participants. So do we have someone who has questions for Paul now?
Well, come on, if you don't ask questions, I'll just start answering random questions.
No, I still have questions for you. Just wait a moment, because maybe someone would hesitate, and find strength to, I see someone. No. Okay. Well, anytime if you feel that you have a question and you want to join our discussion, please feel free to switch on your microphone and interrupt us. And in the meantime, I will ask another question, which has something to do with it, but also it's a little bit different because we are very much, we actually had a whole conference about thinking the position or the profession of a trainer, regardless if it is within a company or organization or working for an outside training company, whatever, how does the position or profession change in time? Because we have all this, software, new applications, new approaches. Some people say the whole profession of the trainer or lecturer will actually disappear, and we will only have artificial intelligence which will diagnose and analyze all the processes that you mentioned, and suggest solutions, you know, and actually deliver the training itself, you know. So what do you think about it? What do you think about?
I don't think AI will get to the point where it's doing the diagnosis I was talking about earlier. I think that will always be a human operation, although AI might help. I think that there's several ways to look at this: short term, medium term, and long term. I think in the short term, people who, and you said the word earlier, lecturer, those who are used to standing on a stage and lecturing, will need to change what they're doing to a more facilitated approach, where they're focusing on helping people collaborate, to reflect, to talk together, to discuss, to do assignments, to practice, to experiment, and then come back together and so on in an iterative cyclic process over time. And that's how it's worked so well at that government department I mentioned earlier, is that's how they've incorporated in. So they have become much more facilitators rather than trainers. So that's the first thing that will work the best and the quickest. And those trainers who don't want to make that shift, I think, are the dinosaurs that will soon lose their jobs as we go forward. And this is even more critical in an online situation than perhaps it was when we were doing the traditional training. So that's the first step. The next one in the medium term is that we will get more and more simulation. So already we've got flight simulators for, you know, which are amazing. I think there's more and more of that coming as we get into more games-based training and things like that. It's not happening immediately because it's expensive, but certainly some big companies around the world are doing quite a lot of work in this area. And then longer term, yes, AI will do a huge amount in terms of delivering learning. I mean, think of the Star Trek holodeck, for those of you who are Star Trek fans, and that's a completely immersive environment run by an AI where you can set things up to teach anything. But what you need to still have is that design process of what needs to be taught and how to design those simulations. And there is still a lot of skills in that area in how do we deliver these new, we're back to that same question. How do we deliver a new set of behaviors to someone? In other words, what experiences do we need to run them through? What tasks and activities do we need to run them through in order for them to get from where they are to where we want them to be? So there is still that design process, but it's much more about behavioral design or behavioral delivery design, if you want to coin that phrase, following a behavioral needs analysis. And see, so many trainers and learners start from a learning needs analysis or a training needs analysis, and that's just the wrong place to start. We should ban those completely and use what I call a behavioral needs analysis or a BNA. In other words, you've got to get your behaviors analyzed first, what you want as an output, and then back, you know, come back from there. So there's your endpoint, and then work backwards. And then you can start building your design. But you need to know the endpoint for that design. So that's where trainers will need to be doing more, is as a facilitator, but also working with, and even the term instructional designer might go out the window because they really should be behavioral change designers. But long term, we'll have holodecks, yoo-hoo, but that's a few decades away, I suspect.
I think actually you followed quite a lot of our concept or our idea about what is going to happen as for the trainer in the future. It actually reflects very much, you know. You were talking a lot about the diagnosis process, you know. Maybe we could see using artificial intelligence in this area, because you can really systemize the diagnosis process, you know, inside the organizations. You can at least some of the processes you can actually measure by some software, using some software. I guess so.
Some of that you could do, but a lot of it will take place through interviews and discussions. And yes, you could have a natural language processor then process recordings of those discussions. but I think there'll still be that human intuition required for many years to come before AI will take over that. I'm not saying it won't, but I think it's a long, and as we go forward, things will get more complex, which probably means that AI won't keep up quite as much because there's still going to be a need to, design things in a way that that works. So I personally don't think AI will take over as much of that analysis process. I suppose it depends on how you're defining that analysis process. The way I'm thinking of it, there's a lot of human interaction, and that's required to generate the discussions and kind of read between the lines and look at people's body language as they're talking about stuff and all the rest of it. There's a skill set in there. And that's a consultancy skill set. And I think it'll be a long time before AI gets good enough at that to supplant human consultants. But actually in L&D, there's part of it, but ultimately that diagnosis process should be taught to managers, because the performance of a team is the manager's responsibility, not L&D's. And yet so many managers come to L&D and say, my team isn't performing well, please fix them. They sometimes don't even say please. And really what they're saying is the team is broken, I'll give them to you and you can fix them. And of course, what they're trying to do is they've got a Teflon desk policy where they're trying to get rid of their problem and give the problem to L&D. And then if things don't work, they can blame L&D. So it's really important that learning and development doesn't take on the problem as their own. It's just saying, no, Mr. Manager, I will help you solve this problem. And we'll go through some diagnostics to figure out the root causes. And by the way, the next time you have a problem, you should do these diagnostics yourself. Now you know how to do them. So that diagnostics process should be done by managers, actually not by L&D. But in the early stages, it will have to be done by L&D because managers just don't know how to do it and don't do it. But it should be part of their toolkit.
You are very much right, but you need a lot of courage to say it to your client who is giving you the money and paying you for some kind of service, and you must tell him the truth and you must be sincere, of course. Sometimes you just don't find enough courage to say so.
I don't think it's about courage. I think it's really just about following a conversation pattern that takes them from where they are to where you want them to be. It's leading them along. It's having that first question. So how do you want them behaving differently to what they're doing now? What do you want them doing instead? And focus the whole conversation on behaviors. And then say, well, what's stopping them doing what you want them to do? And let's dig into that. Let's really find out. Let's go ask them, So don't just take the manager's word for it. There's other people to interview there. Just because the manager says, oh, they don't know anything. Well, no, that might not be right. They might know what to do. They're just not doing it because there's things that are happening or there are obstructions in the way the manager's not aware of. And that's particularly happens where those obstructions are the manager themselves, sometimes less willing to admit that they're actually the root cause of many performance problems, like the donkey in the car with its feet off the ground. That's a management problem. So then you've got to do something with the manager. But at least the diagnostics has surfaced that as a problem.
Right. So I'm still waiting for the participants, someone to join in. Now it's the time. Otherwise, I will have just one last question for Paul. No one is joining us? Okay, Paul, my last question.
Oh, I like your question, so that's good.
What is the height of the Eiffel Tower?
The height of it? I actually don't know. I know it weighs just over 10,000 tons, but I don't know what its height is. So,
okay, but we have one participant joining. Welcome.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, we do hear you.
Okay, thank you for the possibility to be here and for inspirational speech. My impression is these days that all educators at all levels, they acknowledge the shift in pedagogy and pedagogy that will not disappear when we come back to normalcy, I hope. And it is about hybrid teaching. And I think many educators now understand that the in-person teaching provide them opportunity to be for holistic learning and social interaction and so on. And but online teaching and online instructions provide them flexibility. And my question is about the shift to normalcy. How effectively organize hybrid teaching? What will be the crucial for the introduction of effective hybrid education? Because a lot of people change their and also families build their life structures to be functioning in a COVID situation, and now I think it's opportunity to make shift for this hybrid learning and how to do it most effectively.
Well, I mean, the first thing to point out is most of what I've been talking about is about organizational learning, not education in a student university context. So most of my comments have been focused on helping people change their behavior in an organizational context. If you're talking about teaching students, it's a different output. You're looking to help them pass exams. So it's about knowledge transfer rather than necessarily doing something different, although that might be a part of it. But to come back to the educational thing, that's not my area of expertise, education. I'm much more focused on organizational learning. But that hybrid learning thing is going to be a factor in organizational learning as well, where you might well have some students or some delegates in the classroom and some on remote links. And that has already happened. I mean, people have already done that. It's just that in discussions with people who've done it, the challenge is keeping the people on the screens adequately involved with the process, because it's very easy for the lecturer or trainer to focus on the warm bodies in front of them because they can see the body language more easily, and it's much more real to them. And the people on the screens tend to get left out a little bit. But the hybrid thing will be a factor, and I guess part of that is just learning how to do it well, because these are all new skills, and I don't have any silver bullet, do it this way or do it that way. As I said, that's not really my area of expertise, but much of it is just learning by doing and figuring, well, that didn't work, or that worked well. And it's going to be difficult at first. And one of the things that I've talked about with people who've gotten into remote delivery is when we were all forced into remote delivery, me included, I suddenly felt like a toddler again. I mean, I was an athlete. I was running fast. I could do great things in front of an audience at a conference with 1,000 people or whatever. I know what to do. Suddenly I was on screen and I didn't know what to do. And it felt like I'd been, from an athlete, I was busted back to being a toddler, 2 years old, learning to walk all over again. And that felt really uncomfortable. Now, I'm still learning to run again in this new environment on this new track, but it's taking a while. And so we just have to be comfortable with that discomfort while we learn how to use the new way of doing things. And it's interesting you say going back to normalcy. There's no such thing anymore, by the way. So it's just, we carry on doing things the way they're happening now, whatever that is. And that's normal for the moment. And next month it might be different. So if you keep thinking about going back, that's actually kind of quite destructive of what we've learned in the process of getting to where we are. So my advice would be to start talking about how do we move forward rather than how do we go back.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
We have run out of time. I want to thank you, Paul, for a really inspiring discussion. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And I also thank all you participants for participating. And I hope to see you in the next some other occasion within the frame of our EPALE project. We have this online academy, which was actually started at the beginning of the pandemic crisis. as a reaction to it, and it's become really successful. I'm really happy that many people from around the world of training, education have joined us and participated in this project. So thank you all. I wish you a good evening.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great talking with you. And if anybody wants to ask me questions, they can find me on LinkedIn as well. So I'm happy to have a chat or respond. So if anything, comes up from reflection afterwards. But it's been really fun. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I've also enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
That'll be where you go. And that means you won't need the training.